I also know Katie, who invited me to start talking about perhaps doing some training for the Blue Zones agencies and employers. So this is a topic that I've been interested in really even before the pandemic. You know, we're really aware at our organization that we have folks doing really hard work, sometimes under challenging circumstances with folks who've experienced a lot of trauma and adversity in their lives. And so I hope, and I think we've always been kind of tuned in to issues like burnout and compassion fatigue and self-care. But I have to say, it looks really different under COVID and when, you know, we're in this unprecedented kind of situation. And so I'm just going to go on to my next slide. One of the things that started happening early in the pandemic when, you know, everything really quickly moved online and we were trying to push out all these trainings about doing like telehealth and, you know, remote psychotherapy and things like that is one of our staff suggested to me that it might be really nice to do some self-care emails. And I have to admit, like despite having trained on this and everything, it wasn't on my radar at all. But she started us out. This is Babette Reeves, if anybody knows her. She's done a lot of training on trauma-informed care in our community. Babette wrote like a handful of them. And, you know, we all thought we'd be done with this whole pandemic nonsense in a couple of months or something. And so we weren't thinking that far ahead. But eventually it became clear that we were kind of in this for the long haul. So with some help from Babette and occasionally some other guest writers, I started writing first a twice weekly, and now it's been pared down to a once a week self-care email for staff. And so it's been kind of fun. And we've actually, I sent one out today, it was like number 84. So we're like deep in the weeds with this thing now. We keep threatening to like make a book or something, you know, by the time it's all said and done. And so this is actually like an opportunity for me to really think about distilling that down into like what I think some of the key points are. I'm definitely aware of time, and so 45 minutes is, you know, a shorter end of a training. And so if we were meeting a little longer, maybe I would talk to you about like my 10 tips, but I'm going to really try to focus on 5 things that I think kind of encapsulate things that are helpful for most people to do during difficult times. And I also want to invite people, this is like a super small group, so like unmute yourself and make a comment or ask a question. Like I have no issue with being interrupted or pausing what I'm doing. I don't have millions of slides, so some conversation would actually be lovely. And or if you're a person who doesn't feels comfortable doing that, put something in the chat and John can get my attention. We can talk about it. So know that that's an option for yourself. So what are we talking about when we talk about self-care? So I just kind of came up with my own definition, but I'm thinking of activities we engage in to maximize our physical, emotional, and spiritual health. I think historically, when we've talked about self-care, people picture things like massages and pedicures and I don't know what men picture. Those are things that like women often do, and that's a generalization. Men probably do those things now too. But kind of like a spa moment is maybe what we picture. And one of the things that I've really had to come around to myself, and one of the things I try to emphasize, is that self-care isn't necessarily fun or relaxing. It's not necessarily something where we just like, you know, collapse in a pile and somebody does something to us. It can really feel more like work. And so that sometimes forces us to rethink the kinds of things that are really sustaining for us and that we might consider self-care. So, and we'll get into that a bit more. The other thing I also wanted to talk about is just a little bit about different terms that kind of get thrown around related to self-care and maybe even burnout. And so sometimes we're talking about burnout or compassion fatigue, and those are pretty closely related to being the same thing. I mean, I think of burnout as kind of a level of exhaustion, which may have to do with the amount of hard stories that we're hearing or the amount of difficulty that we're dealing with, but it could also have to do with other challenges related to our jobs, like, you know, difficult policies or documentation or electronic medical records or things like that, that can kind of make the work itself feel harder for people. I think of compassion fatigue as when we start to even get a little bit numb to the suffering of other people because we've been maybe not attending to our self-care and maybe doing too much and for too long and kind of running on fumes so we can get weary. We also sometimes talk about collective trauma, and that's the phrase I've heard tossed around a lot during this time, that that, you know, all of us who are living through this really odd time in history have some level of a traumatic response to it, because it's unexpected, it's out of our control, and it's probably impacted our lives in different ways. And without a doubt, we haven't been evenly impacted. I mean, I, you know, feel super fortunate. I have a job and my housing hasn't been in jeopardy with any of this, and that is definitely not everybody's experience, but I think everybody's experience is probably having some worry about catching COVID, having some worry about people we love getting COVID and getting sick, having some worry about, you know, things that are important to us, even if, you know, we kind of know that, like, in the scheme of things we'll be fine, but things like weddings and family reunions and travel plans, those things are important. They're like part of what fills our bucket. And so those things not happening, you know, collectively, we've all experienced some of that. So I'm kind of using all of those terms in thinking about, like, why we need self-care and what's happening with us right now. So let's get into the tips. So the first tip, and this was actually literally the first tip that we, or really Babette, sent out to staff, was to get moving. And it sounds like this actually lines up really well with kind of a Blue Zones initiative that you're working on for later this month. So that's great. So what we know is that we've become a society that's like fairly sedentary. I mean, our work, many of us, myself, I'm like the prime example, like, we're sitting in front of our computers all day long. Maybe occasionally we run down the hall to get something off the printer. Maybe if we're working at home, we, you know, have some other reasons to move around, but we're doing an awful lot of sitting. And we know that that's not super good for either our physical or our emotional health. So moving throughout the day and moving in ways we enjoy is part of our long-term survival strategy in terms of self-care and being sustainable in difficult kinds of jobs. I want to be cautious that I'm not, like, just trying to say, you know, this isn't like a weight loss kind of thing, or this isn't like everybody has to be a runner or everybody has to do Zumba. It's really just about, like, moving our bodies in ways, again, that feel good to us. So for many people that is running or walking, but for other people it might be like dancing or roller skating or gardening, you know, just things that kind of get us up out of the chair and get us doing something. Anybody have anything they want to add to that, or like stories of how much they love moving even though they didn't think they would? Okay, silenced. We'll go on. Okay, so tip number 2, get creative. So again, I think sometimes people can look at things like this and be like, but I'm not artsy or I'm not crafty. But getting creative doesn't have to be limited to those kinds of things. There's a lot of different ways it can look. And so it can be art, but it can also be like gardening or projects or cooking. I know when the pandemic started, there was a lot of content online about, you know, people making sourdough bread and making all these like neat things they didn't normally make. And this is helpful in a couple of ways. I mean, I think the main thing about creative pursuits is they sort of take our immediate thoughts and put us into a little bit more of a flow state or a different mindset. And so one thing that that I've started doing during the pandemic that's been really fun for me is painting. And so I've been, I have always been kind of creative, but I haven't really messed around with paints too much. And I took like an online abstract painting class, and I've been doing stuff with it ever since. But the real joy of it for me isn't necessarily like the product I end up with, which, you know, sometimes you like them better than others, and that's just how that goes. The real joy is just like, I feel like I can turn my brain off a little bit when I go in my garage where my little setup is, and I get into my paints and everything, and I start working. I find that I'm not as inclined to do a bunch of worrying, do a bunch of stress and ruminating, that I'm a little bit more in the moment and enjoying something. And so I think that's true of other kinds of creative pursuits as well. I also think something about these creative things we're talking about, like art or gardening or cooking, woodworking, you know, any kind of creative pursuit, is it really involves our senses. And so things that get, you know, more than one sense engaged, you know, of our five senses, really help us kind of calm down our nervous system. So again, if we think about the things that are creative and the things that we can really lose ourselves in, oftentimes they're like really visual, or they have like a tactile component, or, you know, maybe there's like a smell that's associated with it that's really powerful for us. Playing musical instruments, I mean, it's not a taste and a smell, but it is, you know, it's, I would assume, very tactile, it's very auditory. And so there's lots of things that are coming to play that help us kind of take a step back from our own thoughts and get into something else. Again, anybody want to share anything they've either taken up during COVID or found they had more time? Yeah, Laura.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, my husband and I started watching a cooking channel on YouTube, and actually following along with some of the recipes, and super good, super fun. And my husband was never much of a cook before that. So
yeah,
it was
kind of opened up
time.
And it's also like something you do together, which is kind of cool too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, what's something good you've made recently?
Oh my gosh. Well, it was this winter, and it was Salisbury steak, which I haven't had since I was probably 8, and it came in a freezer container, you know.
I remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dinner. It was so good. And I've started making pizza following this guy on YouTube. So yeah.
Nice. Oh, that's really fun. I appreciate you sharing that. That's super fun. Anybody else have one they want to share that they've been involved with?
I put one in the chat, but mine for me has been hiking and being outside more, which is funny because like a lot of people, we all stayed inside, but being out, you know, once like the wilderness opened back up, and it was never something I enjoyed doing before, but because there was like so few limitations of what you could do, like your norm inside kind of things, that I started doing more outside, and I love it. Just did some hiking this weekend, and I'm absolutely loving being outside.
That's so wonderful. And I would guess that part of that is the sensory aspect of it, that like visually we live in a beautiful place. It smells good here, you know, when the air isn't smoky. You're hearing things like the birds and the babbling of the river and that kind of thing. And it kind of fills our bucket.
Well, and I'm not clock watching. I'm not like, okay, I have to be here at this time and do this and this. I only have so much time for this. It's just like I shut everything else off, and I just enjoy where I am in the moment. And I don't do that as often as I probably should.
Yeah, to have something where you're not rushing is a real treat. And I do think that is one of the gifts of COVID for many people. I mean, you know, it's complicated because people then maybe had other things they had to do, like homeschooling children and things, but that sort of increase in unstructured time, maybe for families in particular who were used to a lot of running kids around to activities or a really busy afternoon schedule, like suddenly to get to hang out together a little bit more was pretty nice. I often think kids will look back on this time. I mean, it's gone on for so long that I feel less confident in this statement, but at one point I thought like kids would look back on this time and be like, oh, that was like the greatest time, because I got to like hang out with mom and dad, and we did, we went for bike rides or this or that. A year of online school, like maybe kids aren't going to be saying how fabulous it was, but I do think there have been some real gifts about it. I'm sorry, my view, I can't see everybody at once with my like double screen thing happening. So definitely just like barge in if you want to say something. So tip number 3, take your breaks and your vacations. So I think we live in a culture that really celebrates busyness as kind of a badge of honor. And sometimes I think even our organizations inadvertently do this. You know, people will get back from a trip and talk about how many emails they have piled up, or how, you know, how many phone calls they have to return and how many meetings they're running to. And there's a little bit of a feeling like the busiest person wins or something. But I think that maybe something that we've learned from COVID is that stepping back and taking some breaks, even if we haven't been able to travel and necessarily take the kind of breaks we like sometimes, has been really good for us. And I think that, you know, Elizabeth's hiking example is a little bit of is kind of a mini vacation or a break too. So that fits in together. You know, I am often aware that, you know, we're supposed to take however many 2 15-minute breaks and a lunch and whatever. And like many people, I'm often like stuffing food into my mouth at my desk while answering emails. And it feels so different for me when I don't do that. Like when I make a point to go for a walk at lunchtime, or even just like get out and sit out in the sunshine for a minute, or even run some errands, which, you know, might not really be a break, but it's even just a change of scenery. I think that's really good for us. And so I hope that through this time, and just, you know, through maybe a general sense of like what's helpful for us, we'll get better about really encouraging each other to take our breaks and our vacations. Another thing that I really see like on my team is that when people take vacation, the first thing they do is tell everybody how they can get a hold of each other. If they, you know, like, I'm going on vacation, but here's all the ways to reach me if you need me. And it's like, you know, what would it be like to create a culture or to support a system where when people are on vacation, they're on vacation, you know, and short of like the whole building is about to burn down or something, like we're just done. So I think those moments where we can really opt out and regroup and refuel are super important to us. And as we discovered during COVID, they don't necessarily have to involve travel or be really expensive. I mean, we're so lucky, I think, in terms of where we live, that we live in this really beautiful place where there's so much to do outside. And, you know, throughout different seasons, even it's pretty easy to be out hiking or walking or getting out in nature in some way. And I think even, you know, even like a staycation where we have some lazy days, or we just do some things that are fairly close to home, that can help us reset in a way that when we come back into our work lives or the busyness of our family life, that we can come in a little bit fresher than we left, hopefully. This one has a lot going on with it. So protect your mental space. And this is probably just like a mashup of a bunch of self-care tips that I've sent out, and also some that I've kind of gleaned from other sources, but let's just talk about them a little bit and maybe where the evidence is for them. And so the one at the top right, protect your mornings, that actually comes from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who's written a couple books on overwhelm and self-care. And I actually have a reference page for her if you're not familiar with her work. She's a really, I think, a really talented writer and trainer, and has a lot of good ideas. But she really talks about like how we might be tempted to start our mornings with things like a lot of social media or a lot of news. And that for most of us, that's not really great for our mental health, to kind of hit the ground running with, you know, things that are more negative or maybe more provocative or alarming. And that if we're trying to set ourselves up for success throughout the day, maybe what we would do in the morning is have a little bit of a softer beginning, where we, you know, maybe we sit and we drink our coffee or tea or our lemon water or whatever we're into, and we, you know, just kind of take things in for a few minutes. Maybe we meditate. Maybe we just like quietly go about making our breakfast and don't necessarily like fill our head with a bunch of media noise while we're doing that. I think it's easier said than done. I mean, we're pretty steeped in, social media and just news culture in general. But I can say for myself, when I do make a point to do this and I just like go and sit in my backyard with a cup of coffee and my dog and just kind of look at my yard and look around, like it feels pretty good to start things out that day. So it's something to think about. The second one, and actually I would be happy to send these slides out if anybody, would find that valuable. So John can let me know if that's something he'd like to do. I can send it out as a PDF. But the second one, banished rumination, is really about catching ourselves worrying about things, particularly work-related things when we're not at work. So I didn't know this until I listened to a TED Talk, and then I wrote a self-care tip about it. But the word ruminate actually comes from what cows do when they're like digesting things in their multiple stomachs. So when we're ruminating, we're like really just like fermenting and reusing a bunch of stuff like fuel. So I thought that was kind of a striking visual about what this actually is. And so, many of us, I'm like the queen of rumination, probably do a lot of like hashing and rehashing thoughts and conversations and things in our mind. And even maybe when we're not at work, thinking about, oh, I wonder how that meeting went, and I should have sent that email, and I wonder how the tone on that other email sounded, and just on and on and on. And so in whatever way we're able to do this, if we can find a way to really disconnect when we're not at work, kind of parking lot those thoughts and ideas until we're back and we're at a place to deal with them, that's really protective of our mental health and our mental space. It has no doubt gotten way worse since social media and electronics and the internet have come to be features of our lives. And so, a generation ago or more, I mean, people weren't just like on the clock in the way that now, we can look at our work emails any time of day, or, people can, from our work team, might text us about something anytime of the day. And of course, that wasn't the case in generations past. And so we're just on more. And so we need to find ways to really turn things off for ourselves. Practicing gratitude, I'm sure this is very familiar to everybody, but there's lots of evidence that people who do some sort of intentional gratitude practice feel better, like it's helpful to their mental health. And there's lots of ways to do that. I mean, sometimes people keep a gratitude journal. Sometimes, like at the end of every day, people think about a couple things that day that they're grateful for. One tip that we pushed out, and I participated in, and a few other people did too, I think, was it's called the 3 Good Things activity. I think it's through Duke University in North Carolina, but it's through an electronic format where at the end of the day, you sort of text in 3 good things that happened that day, and like kind of like what about them was good. So was it a feeling of like connection with other people, or was it like a feeling of competence, or what was it? But that there's evidence that when people do this for a couple weeks, that the effects stay in place for a while. And even doing like a yearly touch-up can kind of help you stay in the more positive and attend to good things in your life a little bit more. So that is definitely something I would recommend. And if anybody needs the link for that, I'm happy to send that out. I think they're actually like collecting research around it still. So there's like, you just like sign up for something on their website, and then you start to get these little text reminders, and they make it very easy for you.
I love it. Yeah, that would be great, Lisa, if you could.
Yeah, I'll make a note for myself. Yeah, because I don't know, like, I mean, I can have good intentions about doing things like that, but the little reminder is definitely a helper, because sometimes you just get busy and you don't. Keeping your perspective, again, I think like over the course of the pandemic, that's probably gotten a little bit harder, but I think that is one of the benefits of not being real young, that when you have, when you've lived a certain number of decades, you can kind of realize that, you know, long-term things that are kind of irritating in the moment or inconvenient or even really hard probably are going to get better over time, and it probably won't always feel this way. It's so much harder for kids because they just haven't lived long enough to have a lot of perspective, and teenagers and whatnot. So, you know, part of our job as the adults in their life is to, you know, keep kind of painting a picture for them that the last year plus hasn't been normal, and that, you know, this will eventually feel like a part of their lives, like not their whole life. But you know, we have to remind ourselves about that too, and when something maybe is happening or not happening that's important to us, like last year particularly, when, you know, maybe travel plans were getting canceled and weddings were getting postponed and those kinds of things, to be able to have kind of the long view about that, which doesn't mean that you don't get to grieve your losses. Like, you get to feel sad that something important isn't happening, or isn't happening in the way you hoped it would happen. Like, that's a reasonable thing to feel sad about, but that, like, in the big scheme of your life, you know, it maybe isn't the most important thing. So again, the more sort of time you've had on the planet, I think the easier it is to do that in a lot of ways, because you've lived through other stuff. Looking for pockets of joy, it kind of lines up with gratitude in some ways, but in a way, you know, joy is maybe a little bit different. But I like to think of it as just like little tiny things that happen throughout the day that make you smile, or, you know, make you feel good, versus hoping or waiting for like the big things. And so, you know, I think for most of us, like, every now and then something really good and exciting happens, but most of the time it's just a lot of like day in and day out. And so if we're looking for little pockets of joy, like, you know, maybe we just like notice something really small that makes us happy. So for me, that might be something like, you know, I'm driving home and I'm parked at a light and I look over and there's like a really cute dog hanging out the window of the car next to me, like panting and smiling at me. Like, that could just be like a little moment of joy. Or you know, I see some really beautiful flowers on my walk. Or, you know, I think all of us probably, like, if the sunset's really beautiful, we like run outside and look at it for a minute. Like, those are little pockets of joy where just for a second we sort of feel connected to the larger world. And then preventing an emotional hijacking. And so, you know, in some of my self-care tips, I've talked about how we are we're very connected, like socially. And so we do this thing called, well, we emotionally regulate ourselves, hopefully, but we do this thing called co-regulation, where we're always kind of picking up the energy of and responding to the people around us, you know, for good or for bad. And so, you know, it's easy to get emotionally hijacked. So if we're having, you know, kind of an okay day and then something happens, and particularly if somebody close to us isn't having a good day, or they're feeling really upset about something, or something's not going right for them, it's easy for us to get hijacked by that. And pretty soon we're not having a good day either. So it takes an intention to be aware of that, and to be aware of like what your risk factors for that are. Like, if you know, if you're already like tired and hungry and stressed, like, you're probably not going to be as resilient about preventing that. But if you're in a pretty good space, sometimes you can see that happening a little bit, and you can be like, oh man, like, I'm really sorry they're having a hard time, but you know, I can't take all that on. And so I think that, you know, for many of us, is a skill that we have to learn, but it feels so much better when we start to learn that even a little bit. Super aware of it because I have young adult children, and it's just like so easy for, you know, something that's going on in their life to just like tip me right over. And it's just like, wait a minute, no, this is like not my stressor, not my thing. They're alive, they're fine. Like, I can, so sometimes it's like doing some self-talk with ourselves to kind of get ourselves back to a good spot. So there's lots of things. This is not an exhaustive list by any means of things you can do to protect your mental space. It helps to, you know, just do some self-reflection about, like, when do you feel your best? What things don't feel good to you? Like, what's in your control? And looking for ways to maximize the things that help us, that actually are in control, to change. And then the last tip is to be nice to yourself. And so actually have a little piece of artwork in my office that says that, and it reminds me of it. And, you know, again, even outside of COVID, just like giving space that I 100% believe that most people are doing their best at any given time, you know, given what's going on in their lives. And if somebody's having a hard day, like I can, you know, I can kind of let that go because I really do just believe that people are showing up and trying and trying to make the best of what are really difficult situations sometimes. I also think it's been really important for us in COVID to like not beat ourselves up if maybe, you know, as we emerge from this pandemic, we're carrying a little bit more weight than we carried going into it, or maybe we've, you know, not just developed some good habits, but we've developed some bad habits or some habits that aren't going to be as sustainable to us. That just, you know, like we can be nice about that. We can be like, you know what, I just lived through something really unprecedented, and you know, maybe not all of my coping skills were perfect, but they weren't really self-destructive either, and you know, I'm doing my best here. And so noticing your self-talk and trying to catch yourself if it veers into the negative a little bit can be helpful. And one thing I've heard described, and I think it's a good way to think about it, is like, you know, how would you talk to like a beloved friend about something? So, you know, if a beloved friend had gained 10 pounds during COVID, would you be like, oh yeah, you really need to, but you know, you have to, whatever? Or would you be like, you know what, I think you're fine. And like, if you know, if it matters to you and you want to start moving more and everything, great, but you know what, you're okay the way you are. Like we would talk differently to a friend than we would talk to ourselves most of the time. So kind of the last thing I wanted to think about with you, and I know we're almost out of time, is to just consider the issue about, is self-care an individual issue or is it an organizational issue? And I would make the argument that it's both. So certainly there's a lot that can and should happen outside of work, you know, in terms of how we attend to our self-care and how we take care of ourselves. And so, you know, preparing ourselves to show up and to be healthy and alert and, you know, well-regulated and all of that at work. But I think workplaces have a role too. And so, you know, creating cultures that allow people to talk about stress or allow people to talk about being overwhelmed, I think is really important. And so one of the things that, you know, I try to ask people about, like within their teams, is like, if you're not feeling okay, or if you're feeling like you actually have way too much on your plate and it's just like not really sustainable, do you feel like you can say that to somebody? And I think it's really important to be able to speak up about that. So in that sense, I think workplaces have a responsibility that that people's jobs are like manageable jobs, and that we're not asking people to put in 50-hour weeks or be, you know, available all day and all night, that there's some limits to it. Supporting in-house wellness initiatives. I know at ADAPT we have a wellness committee. Megan is the chair of that now, which is really cool. And we've done some, in the past, we've done some projects, like we've had like a walking competition, and we have kind of a healthy snack area. And we've done some different things that have tried to get people energized around the idea of tending to their own health. And then, and this isn't an exhaustive list either, but the other kind of big thing I think organizations can do is support employees outside of work. Employee assistance programs, things that help people and their family members get counseling if that would be helpful, or sometimes other supports. Vacation benefits, encouraging people to take their vacations. You know, people shouldn't go years and years without a vacation. And so like if we're supervising folks who don't feel like they have time for that, I think we have a responsibility to kind of lean on them a little bit about what would help them to do that. And, you know, encouraging people to take their lunch breaks and to take their other breaks, just so they can, when they're here and they're sitting at their desk, you know, really be their best self. So I have couple resources here. And again, I'm happy to send out this little PDF of the slides to John. He can pass it on if you want. There's a couple of books by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky that I mentioned that I really like. And then there's just another pretty recent book too by these sisters. One, I think one's a physician and the other's like, she does something in behavioral health, I think, but Burnout, the Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. But it's a lot of kind of the physiology of burnout and toxic stress and what we can do to kind of reset ourselves. So I think it's really good stuff.